Okay then, Thomas Hobbes. And you notice that I'm wanting to introduce Hobbes by talking about his motives. In case of many philosophers this is important, but I think particularly so in Hobbes. I've spent all my reading research time this semester reading nothing but Bacon and Hobbes and secondary materials on Bacon and Hobbes. And the more I've ploughed into the Hobbes literature, the more I become aware that his motivation shapes not only what he thinks, but how he goes about setting it forth. Notice he was born in 1588, and any of you who are familiar with English history know that's the day of the Spanish Armada. In fact, he reports in one place that he was born prematurely because his mother was so scared when the Armada was sighted, which is a rather troublesome way to come into this life. And living as he did over into the early 17th century, he lived through the English Civil War in the 1640s. In that political turmoil, he remained in his sympathies a royalist, but opposed to the divine right of kings, which was, of course, the basis adduced for the absolute authority of the monarch. And so without that basis for authority, he has to wrestle with the question, what basis is there for political authority, if not that? Moreover, he has lived through conflict, the war with Spain, the English Civil War. He becomes convinced that human beings are not by nature, as they come into this world, ready to live in society. Somehow or other, we have to find a basis for establishing law, order, peace in a natural condition where the natural condition is, as he puts it, the war of all against all. The natural condition of man is such that life is nasty, short, and brutish. Well, he has a pessimistic view of human nature, pessimistic view of the human condition. So not only does he need a basis for political authority, but he needs some basis on which social order, some degree of harmony, and certainly self-preservation are possible. Now add to it the religious conflicts. Religious conflicts which underlay both the war with Spain and the conflict with the monarchy in the Civil War. Hobbes' sympathies were with what is sometimes called the broad church, the latitudinarian tradition in the Anglican Church of the day. In that broad church, there was an attempt constantly to avoid religious conflict, to avoid churchly authority that could be the source of persecution of minorities. He wants to avoid sectarianism. Now, remember that the kind of vacuum of authority, the epistemological vacuum left by the breakdown of the medieval synthesis and by the Protestant Reformation, seemed to be leading precisely into sectarian conflicts, into a kind of individualism that is intolerant of others. And Hobbes is tremendously anxious to avoid that. So that in that broad church tradition, his view of church-state relations is essentially Erastian. That is to say, beyond the basic minima of a very broad Christian faith that would affirm the deity of Christ, his work of redemption. Beyond basics of that sort, he was content to leave it to the authorities to say what should be affirmed by the church. Hence, a state church in which the governmental authority establishes the details, rather than leaving it to individuals and to sectarian disputes, which can only upset the peace, cause chaos, produce anarchy, so on and so forth. Now, it's against that background, then, of political conflict, of religious conflict, of violence, and that Erastian attitude of church to state, that Thomas Hobbes comes at his philosophical work, quite independently of the philosophy for which he's famous. He was himself something of a Renaissance figure, very much interested in Plato, and had done some commentary and translation of Platonic type things. He was part of the English Renaissance. He had been for a while Francis Bacon's secretary, and certainly had appreciation of Bacon's empirical, inductive kind of approach to science. But he was not altogether satisfied with that. Hence, motive and method are both necessary for understanding what he's doing. He regarded Bacon's inductive methods as simplistic. Essentially, all that Bacon is doing is defining certain constant conjunctions, as they get to be called later on, certain regularities, that we can make use of in the applications of scientific knowledge. But that's not providing an overall theoretical understanding that can be a basis for what? For a view of human persons, human behavior, and political order. So somehow or other he wants to make the transition from empirical science to the development of an ethic and a political philosophy. And how are you going to do that? Well, he finds his clue in the scientific method that is traced to Galileo. I was going to say was developed by him, I'm not sure of that. But at least traced to Galileo. The method of reconstruction, as it's called, of reconstruction. That is to say, if in analyzing natural processes, physical objects, human bodies, we dissect, we analyze, that's not enough. What we need to do is to reconstruct in some intelligible, rational order our findings, so that from the broad generalizations of empirical science, we can proceed deductively to draw further conclusions. So essentially what is called for is empirical premises, empirical generalizations as premises, empirical premises then deductive inferences to further conclusions, so that the overall scheme that results has the logical form of a deductive system such as we find in mathematics, in geometry, for instance. Now, it's in that regard that Hobbes was impressed by Descartes. Because Descartes, as we've mentioned, and we'll see more as time goes on, Descartes wanted to do philosophy using the method of mathematics. So his initial skepticism is simply a methodological ploy, enabling him to identify and lay aside everything which can even in principle be subject to doubt, so that he can identify what is completely indubitable, beyond doubt, completely axiomatic, self-evident. So that Descartes wanted to start, as it were, with axioms, the way Euclid did, and proceed deductively to the development of his system. Now, Hobbes is not a rationalist to believe in a priori knowledge that is axiomatic. Hobbes is an empiricist. So he cannot start with axioms, he has to start with inductive generalizations. But it is the deductive method of Descartes which impresses him. And so he builds it into this reconstructive method of the sort that he apparently found in Galileo. So you have then this kind of methodological approach. Now, add to that one further methodological assumption. An assumption that I'll put over here because it applies to the whole method. An assumption of methodological naturalism. That is to say, we'll proceed on the assumption that everything can be explained in terms of natural causal processes. The assumption is that everything is explicable in terms of causal processes. Cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. And it's for that reason that you have a unity of all the sciences methodologically. The methods that were initially applied to physics and astronomy are going to be applied to psychology and politics, you see. So that there is a methodological continuity all the way through. Now, in order to see how seriously he takes that, look, if you will, on the anthology, yes, the new anthology, at page 86.